Good day, everyone. I am Enni Pentinpuro, a master's student at University of Helsinki, and today I will be discussing the topic of sexualization of dying women in ancient Roman literature. Now, more specifically, the literature that I'm talking about is Livy's Ab Urbe Condita, which is translated along the lines of The Birth of Rome, and Virgil's Aeneid. I want to explore the topic through three different examples. I have Lucretia, Virginia, and Dido. I also wish to talk about sexualization as a concept and why it seems to be so prominent in the texts that I will be discussing, for I think the sexualizing must have a purpose in the texts. After that, we will study different aspects of the sexualization. To me, the study of these topics is not only about the study of the past, but it also sheds some light on certain themes of the present. Ancient myths and attitudes have had long-standing consequences in the Western psyche, and the retellings of the myths I will explore are not dead to this day. The study of sexualization and the often co-occurring sexual violence is not always pleasant, but it is important. So, as I said, I have chosen two different types of text to explore today, Ab Urbe Condita and Aeneid. Obviously, this sample is very small, and maybe this presentation should be titled The Sexualization of Dying Women in Ab Urbe Condita and Aeneid. However, the sexualization of women's dying bodies is not constrained only to these two texts, and these are mere examples. I could have chosen many other texts as well, but as I am most familiar with these two, I chose to stick with them. But the rape and death of women is a recurring theme in Roman literature. Next up, I will talk about the examples I will be discussing today. I'm sure most of you already know these stories, but if not, I will go through them briefly. Now, to save time, I will not read the entire passages to you, but only go through the stories in a brief manner. I will also mention that my study of these subjects is still in its early stages, so some of these statements might actually still change at one point or another. I also feel the need to warn you about the fact that I am no Latinist, so I hope if you find any mistakes in the quotes, you will let me know via email, but do be gentle. Then, on to the women I will be discussing today. First up, we have Lucretia, who I'd say I am most familiar with, and who is also possibly the most famous of all my examples. She is, of course, the woman who was driven to kill herself with a knife after being raped by Sextus Tarquinius, and her death resulted in the overthrow of the monarchy. This makes her a very important figure in Roman history. Her story also has a very strong undertone of being a moral exemplum. She even states that she sets an example to all Roman women after her. And Lucretia has many depictions across the centuries. Here we have just one painting actually from Helsinki. Next up, we have Virginia, a young girl that the decemvir Appius wanted for himself and claimed was his slave. After this, Virginia is killed by her father, as he sees it is the only way to keep Virginia's freedom. This in turn leads to the overthrow of the decemvirate. So again, an important figure in Roman history. Lastly, we have Dido, the Queen of Carthage. The Carthaginian queen who loved Aeneas and decided to commit suicide after being abandoned by him. Dido is different from Lucretia and Virginia in the sense that the sexual actions that occur seem to be consensual. The story seems to punish her for her actions, however, as I will discuss a bit later. Dido is also an important part of Roman history because her curse on Aeneas establishes the rivalry between Carthage and Rome. As you can see from these examples already, all of the deaths are rather important for subsequent events. Next, we shall examine the concept of sexualization and how it applies in these stories. Now, sexualization in short is to make something sexual. And as I stated before, the sexualization of dying women is a recurring theme in Roman literature. But it is important to ask why. There are several reasons as to why this occurs, and I have listed only a few that I have found in my studies. For example, there is the reason to use the woman as a symbol and make the story an allegory. This is possibly the most important motive, as the deaths of beautiful and lust-evoking women often give way to reforms and important political shifts. So in these stories, the deaths of the women serve a narrative function. Another reason is to explain sexual things happening to the woman. If the woman is sexualized, it makes sense that sexual things were to happen to her. However, I'm pretty certain that this reason doesn't exist on its own, as is the case with all of these reasons below. Another reason might be to simply to please the reader. In all instances, I have explored the authors, the readers, and the crowd in the stories are generally male, which can be talked about as the male gaze, which is a term very often used in discussions about modern media. However, something that is not so modern is Virgil, setting an example of this with his opening words in the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano. Another reason might be to teach about gender. Roman epic, for instance, was used as learning material in schools, and they were used to establish the differences between genders. And of course, there is also the reason of simply imitating Greek stories about deaths of women. But as I said, none of these reasons really exist on their own, but they co-occur. Now, let's move on to the different ways of sexualizing the women in these texts. Personally, I think the most important way of sexualizing these women is how the authors talk about their appearance. All of the women are described as beautiful and lust-evoking, and the beauty and appeal of the three women give an excuse to the deeds done to them. For instance, we have some passages from Ab Urbe Condita here. Virginia is described as a remarkably beautiful grown girl in this passage. This way, Livy gives a reason for Appius's lust by explaining that Virginia was beautiful and a grown girl, which is why Appius could not control himself. Another passage from the same story describes Virginia's beauty as unhappy, or a rather charming translation, ill-starred. So basically this means that what happened to Virginia was the fault of her beauty. Now, this to me is a very exemplary example of the sexualization I am talking about. Virginia is described as someone who is so beautiful in a sexual way that it can be impossible to control oneself around her. And the key point in this slide is that the women are sexualized by describing their appearance as sexually exciting. Another way of sexualizing the women is sexualizing their behavior and their emotions. The behavior and emotions can also be seen from the outside, and it can show up in the appearance of the woman, so this part is also linked to the earlier section. In this passage, we see Queen Dido in a rather frantic stage. She is depicted showing feverish emotion that is also reflected in her body. She has bloodshot eyes and quivering cheeks, and she is trembling and frantic. The description is very reminiscent of an erotic scene. Dido displays symptoms of almost being sexually aroused. And this intense emotion that Dido expresses proves to be lethal. Dido is rather emotional throughout the Aeneid, and I think in the text, emotionality and sexuality are mingled together. And my key point in this slide is that the women are sexualized by describing their emotions as something that reflect and mix with sexuality. Now, In these texts that we are exploring today, all of the women have something sexual happen to them, either by force or consensually. Especially in the case of Lucretia and Virginia, their chastity is something that is of pivotal importance in the texts. What I find interesting in their cases is that it seems that their chastity was something that excited their abusers. This raises a question of how can a woman ever be safe in the Roman world? If chastity is sexualized and makes a woman desirable, what is there to do? And I think it's important to note that all of the women I discuss suffer from either their chastity or the lack of it. And now I think one reason as why chastity might excite the Roman man is that chastity makes a woman more difficult to conquer. So having sexual relations with a chaste woman would be a victory. And I use military language in this case because I think it fits the Roman thought process where war in all aspects of life is extremely important. And there is a passive and an active participant in sex. Livy uses this kind of language in the rape of Lucretia, where he describes Tarquinius as exulting in his conquest of a woman's honor. And my key point in these slides is that the women are sexualized by observing their sexual actions or the lack of them. Another aspect that we can shortly look at is the use of marriage beds in the stories. Both Lucretia and Dido suffer because of the acts that happened in their marriage beds. Dido even burns her marriage bed with Aeneas when building her pyre on which she will die on. This is, to me, a very obvious way of sexualizing the deaths, mingling sex with violence and eroticizing death. And the key point in this slide is that the women can be sexualized by bringing forth a place where sexual actions take place. Another object we can look at is the knife. All three women are killed by a knife or a blade. The blade can be interpreted as a phallic symbol. The blade in these myths not only very violently impales the breast of the women, but also threatens them before death. The threat and death with a phallic object underlines the hierarchy between male and female. However, it is also important to note that dying by a knife or a dagger or a sword was considered a heroic and a courageous virtus death. This does not so much have to do with sexualizing, but I am merely putting it out there that the knife can be interpreted in many ways. And my key point in this slide is that the women can be sexualized by using a phallic weapon for their deaths. Last aspect I will examine is showcasing the dead bodies of the women. Both in Lucretia's and Virginia's stories, their dead bodies are shown to the public to encourage action. Dido's body is also being perceived by other people who see her bloody hands and her former lover's dripping sword. And this description is, in this case, is a mixture of violence and sex. The quote is actually from A.M. Keith, not directly from an ancient passage, but this is essentially what happens in the text. The beauty of the woman also comes to play in these passages. For instance, in Virginia's case, which we already examined, her ill-starred beauty is what is the cause of her death. All of these deaths are a spectacle. None of the women die alone. And the key point here is that the beautiful corpses of the sexualized women serve a narrative function. They encourage action. Lastly, I would like to conclude my findings. I think a beautiful woman's body's purpose is to inspire emotion and thus action. The death of a beautiful woman or girl, as is the case with Virginia, is instrumental, not an event in itself. All the women discussed in this presentation must die in order for the story to continue. This gives the women a narrative function. The function is secured by them being sexually desirable and active or passive. They die partially because of their sexual deeds or the sexual deeds inflicted upon them. Sex and violence are mingled together, and it seems that a woman cannot win when it comes to sexuality, or at least not live. And here is my list of literature and my contact information. I thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. Thank you.